This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Glynn Tonsor, K-State livestock economist, kicks off today's show with a cattle market update where he discusses the current market, meat demand, and what we will learn from upcoming reports. The show continues with K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon and K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff as they provide an update on cotton pests, and the western bean cutworm. K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts ends today's show as he explains what people should do if they accidentally hit wildlife with their machinery. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update from K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me in.
Glynn, what are we seeing for the cattle market?
So mixed bag would be the statement for this past week and kind of where we're sitting here in the middle of July. We're going to cover the market and talk about some demand issues and some upcoming reports that will hopefully update that perspective. But when we look at AMS, they called the Fed cattle market on Friday at 235, basically flat from the week. There was a couple states were down a little bit, but I will interject, that's a full $25 above where we were a couple months ago. So, we are sort of due for a pause, so to speak, there. When you look over to the feeder cattle market, AMS called the Kansas markets quite light mixed. It's not uncommon, but the volume is pretty low for this time of year. There's a weaker tone in some of the AMS commentary. But two lots I noted here just for some reference is one lot of 55 head that weighed 870 pounds, came in at 318. A little bit heavier lot at 924 pounds came in at 305. Both of those would be a little bit of a pullback from the last couple of weeks. Again, there's just a pause in the market, I think. When you look over at the futures market, this is the disconnect from the cash market, is we actually had notable strength this past week. So August live cattle was $222, up $8 on the week, and then August feeder cattle was $326, up a full $25 on the week. And I'll pause here for a moment, is particularly on fed cattle, the cash market has been ahead of CME contracts for quite a bit here in 2025, and we saw a reversal of that this past week. Some of that is inevitable, as the cash and futures do end up aligning, and that's part of what we saw occurring this past week.
What are some reasons for that tightening market?
Uncertainty is the word for 2025. We are in the middle of July, and I was hoping I'd be using that word less, but I think it still applies a lot. And particularly on the supply side, we have sort of known domestic supply tightening, and it looks like that might get ramped up for two different reasons. Is the ongoing discussion around screwworm. Listeners here probably are well aware of the adjustments in imports from Mexico and the risk of screwworm to our own herd, as well as tariff announcements to Brazil specifically, and then more broader what the beef import situation might look like. You could pretty easily make an argument that the herd is known to be small, and some of those adjustments might make it even smaller from a beef availability perspective. So I think that's at play. I want to interject, though, I was in San Diego this past week for the summer business meetings, doing some beef checkoff work oriented around the Meat and Man Monitor, report out and proposal for renewal and so forth. And there is notable producer optimism. So industry leaders, state beef councils, and so forth are the ones that are typically at those meetings. And when you put a bow around what I just said, there is net optimism, but some, I'll call it a cautious tone with it, because everybody knows there's a lot of money at stake in the industry now. I want to interject that here because we've had quite a bit of a run-up in the cattle market, and that shows up in the producer sentiment.
What are we seeing for box beef cutout?
So we saw a fairly big pullback this past week. So Choice Friday was $379, down from $390 the prior Thursday. I'm giving us Thursday because of the 4th of July effect. Select was $366, down $12 from the prior Thursday. And again, here I think is the market seeing those inner demand signals that we're going to talk about here in a minute, and some softening. As
we talk about your meat demand monitor, what are you seeing for people's willingness to pay for meat products?
Yeah, so softening is the numbers to share there. The latest report is for the month of June. And the willingness to pay, which is our demand metric, as you alluded to, declined in 7 of the 8 items for retail, or think grocery store for at-home consumption. And it also decreased on 7 of the 8 meals that we track for away from home. So we track food service demand, the dinner meal specifically. And those comments about declines are June is lower than May. And I'll interject here, May was lower than April, for those that remember. So we've had some pullback in stated willingness to pay here. I think that, and I'm going to belabor this in a minute, is the public is just getting more cautious. That's not to say they don't want meat protein. Actually, taste still leads the day. They want to have, meat is having a moment in desirability. It's not an anti-meat kind of thing at all. I think it's a macroeconomic concern.
As we see people's willingness to pay decrease, are people still eating meat products?
They are. They're just finding different ways to do it or stretch it or have smaller, portions, all those kind of adjustments. They're more likely to be doing it at home. So one of the things I didn't put in my notes here, but I'll just remember to call out to the June report is, we're seeing meals at home relative to away from home grow. You need to watch the lunch meal in particular for that, the dinner meal for that. The lunch one, people decide whether or not they're going to take leftovers to work, or some people that work from home, obviously they're going to eat at home because they're working, they're synonymous for lunch meal. But deciding the source, which is what we're talking about here, is the source of the protein for those meals. One of the key things we see people do when they're worried about their finances is go to restaurants less. And I'm interjecting that because that is not a meat comment. It has implications for meat, but it's a broader one about like starting with the household budget is how do we optimize that? And if I can clean the dishes and food, do the food prep myself, I can stretch my dollar a little further. And that's what I think we see more and more households doing.
Everyone's still eating meat, just they're eating at home, not in a restaurant.
They're eating at home. They're, maybe using meat as an ingredient. And when you do that, you could stretch it. So if I buy a pound of ground beef and I put it into a lasagna, you can, put a few more noodles and a little bit less ground beef. I mean, lots of versions of that. So they still want meat, but if meat is expensive relative to other things in your broader budget, you're finding a way to stretch that. I'm really trying to emphasize this is a macroeconomic part, not an anti-meat. There's not a safety perception concern or a quality of the product concern and so forth. And the reason that's important for most of our listeners here who are, day-to-day in the industry is there's not much you can do about this because it's a broader macroeconomic thing is, I can't influence U.S. GDP and nobody on here can raise average incomes in the U.S. and those kind of things. We can, however, influence the quality of beef, pork, and chicken, right, and the perceptions of safety over time. And, those things you can have some say on. And at the moment, that's not where we have challenges.
Isn't this also potentially where the cattle producers are also feeling it and making these decisions as well?
Yes. And to jump ahead for a moment here, we're going to talk about some upcoming reports. Kind of the million-dollar question or multi-million-dollar question is, are those producers going to pull the trigger on herd expansion? So if you are, selling cattle for a fairly high price and you're comfortable with that, but you're not necessarily comfortable with it being multi-year, like how long will it last? Or you're spending more to raise that calf than you ever thought you would, and you're just cautious about it, those are going to give you some pause in pulling the trigger on heifer retention. And I noted here at the end here is we have a couple reports in July coming up. So the July cattle inventory report comes out every 6 months from USD NASS, and then the July cattle on feed report, which is a monthly report we more often reference here on these things. Quarterly, the cattle on feed report gives us a gender breakdown, so steer versus heifer inventories and placements. And this will sound geeky, but the percentage of heifers that are in the yard is one of the best measurements for herd expansion. So as the population in the feed yard becomes more steers, that generally tells us there's more heifers staying at home. And as there's more heifers in the feed yard, that means they showed up in the feed yard. So we're watching for that retention metric. And in the days ahead, we're going to see that, I think.
If more heifers are not in the feed yard, does that mean supplies are going to tighten some more?
In the short term, yes. And a distinction is important here is the calf crop is shrinking, so steers and heifers is going to decline, but hence the percentage part that we're highlighting. In the near term, yes, you will have a 2-year reduction, right, in beef availability because you took some of the heifers that would have went through the production system sort of immediately through the feed yard to give us beef and kept them at home. Now, that's a necessary evil in order to grow the herd, but it will make the quote-unquote tight beef supply story even tighter in the short term to later, 2 to 3 years out, start reversing that narrative.
And coming back to your meat demand monitor, how are people feeling about their household finances?
I'm trying to set the tone here, and I am trained to be a pessimistic person. That's not the point here, but just let the data speak. And the meat demand monitor for June specifically, we're talking about 19% reported out that their household finances have improved versus last year. And that's great for that subset, but the fact it's only 19% is the challenge. That's up versus 18 in May, so not a big change from May, but in big picture, this is lower than it was a couple years ago. That number was 22 to 26%, depending on what month we might be quoting. Those that report finances are improving, not surprisingly, also tell us they had more meat yesterday. So we have a prior day meal inclusion exercise here. So I could tell you who had beef for breakfast, who had pork for lunch, and so forth, and sum that up across different proteins. And those that say their finances are doing better than last year consume meat more often, and they're willing to pay more for it. And importantly, they're spending more on food, both at home and away from home. So that's broader than just meat. Conversely, the opposite, right? So those that say their finances are declining, which was 34% in June, are much less likely to have had any of the major meat proteins in meals, so fewer number of meals yesterday for that group. And they tighten their wallet on food spending, and they tighten it even more on away from home. So they spend less than those that are optimistic about their finances in both at home and away from home, but they particularly spend less away from home, and that just starts with less foot traffic. They just don't patron restaurants at the same rate.
And Glenn, at the beginning of this interview, you mentioned a mixed bag for the cattle market. Do you think we're going to continue to see that?
Yeah, as I noted, we're 7 months into the year, and uncertainty is the word of the day, and that is not unique to the beef and cattle market at all. We definitely have lots of macroeconomic uncertainty. You and I are talking here early Monday morning, and to be determined what the tariff narrative this week is, and I highlighted that has direct implications. We're talking about Brazil and imports as one example of that here, right? So I think the uncertainty is going to persist, and typically with uncertainty, you have more volatility in markets, and that would be my best forecast for the balance of 2025.
If people want to find your meat demand monitor, how can they do that?
So they can find everything we referenced on AgManager.info. For those that aren't familiar, maybe aren't quite as tied to K-State, that is our extension outreach research website in the Ag Econ department. There is a meat demand section, and then within it, there is the meat demand monitor specifically. And then there's cross links to things like USDA's NASS reports and so forth, if that helps people find them.
Glenn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me on.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. I will link his meat demand monitor in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show with an update from Western Kansas with K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon and K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff. Logan, Anthony, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Thanks, Shelby.
Thank you.
Logan, as we're talking about Western Kansas, first an update on cotton. How is it looking?
Yeah, so cotton in the state of Kansas has been somewhat behind compared to past years, but as of this week, we are firmly into squaring across most of the state. What that means is that we are finally reaching that point in the growth and development of cotton where we're putting on those fruiting branches, starting those pinhead and up to match head squares. And getting that crop on and moving through reproductive stages. A little bit behind where we were last year, but happy to see that crop moving through squaring here. Overall, we're looking at a pretty solid crop across the state. Some folks might recall from a previous interview that we had on here talking about all crops and some storm damage. We do remember that South Central Kansas had some significant storm damage that wiped out a fair bit of the clean till cotton that was in South Central. Those any cotton that was planted no-till, even with a little bit of residue, with what little cotton on cotton we have in South Central Kansas, that was enough to protect most of those stands. So, all in all, I think we are holding on fairly well for a lot of the crop. As we started the season, we always remind people to keep an eye out on those thrips as our most common insect pest in cotton. And now that we are making our way into squaring here in the States, we want folks to be really thinking about those fleahoppers as well as Lygus bugs, or what we call the tarnished plant bug.
And wanting to talk about a few of those insects today, Anthony, can you tell us some information about the cotton fleahopper? What is it?
Yeah, so cotton fleahopper, as well as the tarnished plant bug that Logan just mentioned, they're both true bugs, and they have piercing, sucking mouth parts. And so they're going to be gravitating towards fruit production on a variety of hosts. And so when we get to cotton, they're going to be going after those squares, sometimes even very new leaf buds and stuff like that in terminals. And they're going to be feeding on those squares, and their saliva is going to be damaging the internal structure of those squares, causing them to be necrotic and drop off. So these two insects can be very detrimental to overall yield this time of year if you have large populations. So it's important to be scouting for them right now through the end of squaring.
Where can growers be scouting for them? Edges of the field, middle of the field, and where on that plant?
You would want to start with a lot of pests. You start on the edges of the field, and if you see a population, you want to get more into that field. I would say definitely explore, go into the field a bit, especially if you're seeing them easily on the edges of the field. But there's a couple different methods you can use for these two insects. They're very excitable, especially the cotton fleahopper. It is very mobile. It will jump from you, drop off the plant really quickly at any kind of disturbance. So they can be kind of tricky to scout for, but you could use a sweep net, you could use a drop cloth, and if you do that, you'll put like a drop cloth between the rows, and then you'll hit the plants so that any bugs on those plants will dislodge and land onto that drop cloth, and you can take quick counts. If you're using a sweep net, you just kind of sweep across the rows as you walk through the field, and then count how many of those bugs you have in your net. And depending on the method, the thresholds will be different. So you just got to know what the threshold is based on the method you're using, and you could get that information with our cotton insect management guide. All those details are in there. But those are the two methods you want to use. But again, these insects are going to be kind of concentrated towards those developing squares because they really like that new developing fruit and developing tissue.
What do these insects look like?
Well, the cotton fleahopper is going to be it's smaller than the tarnished plant bug. I think it's probably about 1/8 of an inch total in length. It's kind of a lime green color with a little bit of white speckling. Very small. You'll see kind of like lime green insects hopping all over the place if they're abundant. The tarnished plant bug, again, like I said, is also a true bug. Kind of similar body shape. They're both kind of football shaped. But the tarnished plant bug is going to be more like a brownish kind of tan true bug, and probably twice the size as the fleahopper.
How do people need to control them?
Right, so for control, if you actually get the threshold in the field, so you're seeing a number of insects that matches the threshold based on your scouting method, and you're seeing a certain percentage of drop squares, when you combine those things together and you're at threshold, there are a lot of products that can control these two insects, varying from pyrethroids to organophosphates. And again, those particular products can be found in our cotton insect management guide. There's a lot of options, basically. So if you do get to threshold, you don't have to worry about having a lack of control options for these two pests. The important thing is people need to get out there right now, and they need to be scouting. You want to be proactive, not reactive.
Have you seen fields where the cotton fleahopper or the Lygus bug, also sometimes referred to as the tarnished plant bug, take out an entire field?
I have not. I think of them as they can be potentially very problematic as they are targeting our developing squares. And as they catch those, especially these early first position squares that we know contribute the most to our final yield, that is really the critical time when we want to be out there scouting for them. I haven't necessarily seen them take out entire fields in the state of Kansas, but right now really is that time frame. We've got to be on top of them. One thing I would tell growers to keep in mind, though, as we move through the season is remember that especially here in Kansas, a lot of our later developing squares are not really going to contribute all that much to the final yield of that cotton crop. And so in that way, the amount of attention that we are paying to these sorts of pests, the fleahopper and plant bug, tarnished plant bug, becomes much less, as we don't necessarily expect those later squares to contribute much. But it is really these early and first position squares that we are trying to protect here with this vigilant scouting.
Anthony, if a producer sees that they've passed the threshold for needing to treat their field, do they have to worry about future generations of these insects?
There will be a couple generations of both species, but like Logan was saying, you really got to take into account the reproductive stage of that field. So like he was saying, those later squares maybe not be of much concern. So you just kind of have to couple the presence and the threshold with what stage that field is in. So if there's still early squaring, there's still a lot of risk and you might need to do something about it.
And another pest that people could be seeing, not in their cotton fields, but maybe in their corn fields, the western bean cutworm. And what is this pest?
The western bean cutworm is a moth that is native to North America. It's found in Kansas. It's found in a lot of our neighboring states across the country as well. And it is a pest of corn, particularly corn ears. So the caterpillars of western bean cutworm are going to be attacking corn ears coming up soon. We got a lot of fields tasseling in western Kansas right now. And the western bean cutworm, what it does is it overwinters in the soil as pupa. And about this time of year, so mid-June through early July, the adult moths are going to be emerging from the soil, and they're going to be gravitating towards cornfields. The timing is basically around tassel, and the females are going to be laying eggs in cornfields. And those eggs are going to be hatching, and those caterpillars are going to quickly be migrating towards those developing ears. And once they get into the ears, they're going to start consuming developing kernels. They're going to clip silks as they go in there and cause reductions in yield. So that is definitely a pest that folks need to be scouting for right now in western Kansas, cornfields, especially fields that are approaching tassel.
So why are we concerned about them being in cornfields when their name has bean in it?
That's a good question. So western bean cutworm, it has kind of an interesting history. So this particular moth was historically isolated to very southwest United States, northern Mexico, and it was a pest of dry bean production. So think like pinto beans, things like that. And it really wasn't anything to speak of for a long time. And then beginning in the late 90s, early 2000s, it quickly expanded its range north, up through the Midwest, up into the upper Midwest, and even to the Great Lakes region very quickly, and established itself as a pest of corn production. Again, it's going to be the caterpillars are attacking the ears. And this at the time was very unexpected. And what folks have determined what caused this is basically at the time where western bean cutworm was able to expand its range very rapidly in corn and become a new pest of corn, at that time, BT technology, genetically modified corn, was widely adopted across the United States and corn production regions. And that technology did a really great job of eliminating corn earworm, another pest of corn production. And so with all these millions of acres of corn clean of corn earworm caterpillars, western bean cutworm was able to fill that void. And that's what happened. So those BT technologies originally were not designed to control western bean cutworm, and so they had no control over it. And so that's how we kind of took on a new corn pest, which is still prevalent, again, mainly in western Kansas. It is a pretty big issue in Nebraska and the upper Midwest. It's pretty sporadic in western Kansas, but northwest Kansas, it's definitely a serious pest that folks should be scouting for.
Anthony, Logan, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff and K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon. I will link the resource that Anthony mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net, and I will also link agronomy e-updates on this topic. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Shelby.
Drew, talking on a few just random topics involving wildlife. And the first one, if our farmers are out in the field and they see a baby deer or maybe a big deer, what should they do if they're in their combine or swather?
Yeah, I think if it's possible to harvest around those animals and not have to try and get out and move them or anything like that, then that's really the best thing to do would be to just go around. And a lot of times if you did go around a fawn or an adult deer that was bedded down that didn't want to move, if you come back in an hour, maybe you move on to a different part of the field, you come back after you've harvested the rest of the field, a lot of time they will have moved on their own. If they haven't, then you can get out a fawn. We don't encourage people to handle wildlife, but if you did see a fawn in a place where you needed to harvest and you need to do it right now, then it would be okay to move that animal out of the way. We worry about getting human scent on critters and mothers refusing them and stuff like that. Some of that's true. Some of that is more things that we tell young people to get them to leave small wildlife alone. So go around them if you can, but if you can't, then you could move them. If it's an adult deer, that is a more challenging situation, and I would not get out and try to move that animal. I would come back another time when you could harvest that spot without it being there.
What if they don't see the wildlife and accidentally hit it and it's now dead? What should they do with it?
Yeah, so that's a very common thing, especially this time of the year if we're swathing hay and we're in a tall hay crop. So if you do injure an animal or kill an animal, there are a couple things you can do. If you're out in the field where that happened, when you discover that it happened, just moving those remains to a spot where they're no longer in your way. We've got all kinds of scavenging animals out there that will clean that up and be glad to have the meal. If, let's say, you got back to the farmstead and found a fawn that had run through some equipment or parts of a fawn or a deer or something inside of equipment that's dead, there's a couple of things that would be appropriate. If it makes sense to take that animal to a spot where the scavengers can get to it, that's great. You can also double bag them and dispose of them in the household trash.
What if you see a raccoon or skunk or something like that cornered in a shed and you're trying to get your work done?
Yeah, if we have a critter like a raccoon or a skunk or an opossum in a shed, we can oftentimes be not aggressive, but herd that animal out of the building the same way that we might coax, let's say, a chicken back into its coop or something like that. We can quietly walk toward the animal, pay attention to the cues that it's giving us. If it acts like it's threatened, then back off a little bit. But most of the time, if there's a raccoon in somewhere that we don't want it to be, or even a skunk, if you walk slowly towards it, talk in a quiet voice so that it knows that you're coming, but also that you're not threatening it by yelling and being aggressive, then a lot of times they'll just go ahead and move on out of the way, and you could kind of herd them out of the building. If that doesn't happen, and you could, let's say you have a live trap, you could capture that animal with a live trap, set the trap, bait it, come back a little bit later. Either the animal's going to be gone or you may have caught it in the trap, and then you can just take it outside and relocate it that small distance. That only really makes sense if we have a shed or a shop building that can be closed up well, though, and the animal can't get back in. It may be appropriate in that situation to euthanize the animal that you catch so you do not continue to have that problem happening. In all these situations, if we have to handle either a dead animal or an animal in a cage, remember that all these critters can give us diseases. It's also possible for an animal to reach through a cage trap sometimes and claw us. So be thinking about, appropriate safety measures, maybe leather gloves if we're dealing with an animal that's still alive in a cage. Definitely want to have some latex or nitrile type gloves, disposable protective gloves if we're handling a dead animal.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.